The Emotional Vampire. Hello, I'm H.G. Tudor. A number of years ago, I wrote on my blog, Knowing the Narcissist, which you'll find at narcsite.com, and I've spoken about it since, in relation to how I'd once spent some time looking through the various offerings from supposed relationship experts. I spent an afternoon perusing the websites, the blogs, and to some extent videos of a variety of individuals of varying degrees of expertise, both in terms of qualification, experience, and standing, as again and again and again they advised on circumstances which included clear examples of narcissists, and in each and every instance they failed to identify that there was a narcissist. Now, I appreciate that for ethical reasons, certain practitioners cannot say that the individual is a narcissist without having undertaken a one-on-one examination. But what they could do is suggest that that might be the case, or at least, without using the N word, talk about all of the behaviours associated with the narcissist to help the person that they were talking to or writing to. The difficulty was that in each instance, they failed to identify the person was a narcissist, and furthermore, it was quite clear that it didn't even become a consideration for them because their advice thereafter was not only misleading, unhelpful, but in some instances downright dangerous. Rather than explain how the principle of GOSO, once you know you go, you get out, and you stay out, should be applied, these supposed relationship experts, love doctors, gurus, call them what you will, suggested if you love him harder, it'll work out. You need to spend more time together. Try to rekindle the intimacy. And many other instances which showed that they hadn't got a bastard clue what they were talking about, and they were making life more difficult. They failed to recognise this person was dealing with a narcissist. They failed to tell them as such, or if they were not able to do so, they failed to give the right advice to the individual, which was to get out. Instead, they gave them hope. And hope is something that the narcissist will exploit. Hope, as I've explained before, is the ultimate manipulation because it causes the victim to believe that something can be achieved when in actual fact it cannot. It causes them to apply resource, effort, energy, emotion, and money to achieve an outcome which is beyond them. Hope is a false mistress. One of the major problems that arises from this type of conduct is that there is this repeated failure to identify a narcissist and instead use euphemistic descriptions to describe the narcissist. Now, I know certain of you are familiar with the alternative descriptions for narcissists and immediately recognise, that means narcissist. But there are plenty of people who don't. And this euphemizing is dangerous. One of those euphemisms is to describe us as an emotional vampire. Now, there may be some that will say, well, that is quite apt, HG. There is a vampiric nature to the narcissist. After all, the vampire preys on people. The narcissist absorbs the blood of the victim. So to be vampiric suggests that you're absorbing the emotion, the energy, whatever it might be of the victim. Indeed. So to an extent, it's accurate. But that doesn't convey the nature of the manipulations. The absence of emotional empathy, the fact that the narcissist can't change. It doesn't help you understand the dynamic between the victim and the narcissist. It doesn't tell you about hoovering. The problem is that whether it's an intimate or non-intimate relationship, making reference to emotional vampires when in actual fact you ought to be referencing narcissists is unhelpful, as a recent article that appeared written by Elle Hunt in the Guardian newspaper tells us. She wrote, Ellie used to wonder why she always felt drained after spending time with her friends. Then she noticed they were constantly complaining about their jobs or their partners without ever taking steps to change. Or else they would select an unsuspecting victim and sink their teeth into them. They didn't want to hear about Ellie, the changes she was making in her life, the new business she had started. So failure to listen, self-absorption, and they certainly didn't want to hear that it was going well, she says. You almost felt like you couldn't fit in with them unless you were moaning about something. It would appear that they would be envious of her success. Maybe you have one of these characters in your life, an old school friend perhaps, who consistently leaves you feeling worse than before you met up with them. In psychological shorthand, they are known as emotional vampires for their ability to suck the pleasure from a social interaction, and your energy along with it. But what are the signs that you are in one's clutches, or that you've become one yourself, and how can we best handle such relationships? There are some people who have an excessive need for attention and validation, says Susie Redding, a psychologist and chartered member of the British Psychological Society. Well, what is she referencing there? A narcissist, of course. They are often overwhelmingly negative or display a victim mentality, refusing to believe that anything that happens to them is their fault. Again, descriptions that fit with the narcissist. A lot of times, they don't actually want solutions or advice, they just want to offload. And while they may be intently focused on themselves, there's not a great deal of self-awareness. Again, apt descriptions of the narcissist, but not actually saying that's what the individual is. It's not just their own patterns of behaviour that these individuals are oblivious to. Emotional vampires are defined by their inability to empathise, lack of emotional empathy, narcissist, leading them to vent their frustrations without thinking how it might affect or be received by the other person. Carla Manley, a clinical psychologist based in California, says such behaviour reflects a lack of emotional intelligence. When somebody is an empathic human being, even if they have a high need, when they reach out for support, they will be aware of your emotional state first. They might ask you if now is a good time to talk, boundary recognition, or pick up on cues that suggest it isn't. Emotional vampires pay no such mind, says Manley. They are only caring for their own appetite, their own needs. The key point is that the behaviour is consistent, even chronic, says Manley, i.e., repeated behaviours over a sustained period of time. There are many reasons a friend might temporarily be more demanding or less present, such as after a breakup or a period of poor mental health, external stresses, which would affect the emotional empathy of a non-narcissist. But in functional friendships, there is an underlying sense of give and take, i.e., emotional empathy. We want somebody to be invested as we are invested, a mutual reciprocity. It's not always 50-50, but overall there is a sense of balance. An emotional vampire will resist that equilibrium, betraying a fundamental egocentrism. Any attempt to change the subject can be met with one-upmanship, that is a narcissistic indicator, dismissiveness, which is an indicator of haughtiness, or even hostility. If you do then challenge them on it, they're so resistant that you might end up getting attacked. Reaction of threat to control. But to characterise one person as the predatory bloodsucker and the other as their hapless victim can be reductive. After all, vampires can't prey on just anyone, you have to invite them in. If someone has managed to get into this position of being completely domineering, then obviously we've allowed it to some extent or possibly enabled it, says Jenny Van Hoof, a sociologist at Manchester Metropolitan University. Even with the best of intentions, it can be all too easy to get sucked into the dynamic. Beth, 38, befriended a friend of a friend, wishing to support her through her first pregnancy. Emotional empathy. The younger woman struggled with her family and was not in contact with the father of her child, and Beth thought she could help. But every time they spoke, Beth felt depleted, depressed and helpless. I started to realise that I'd repeat the same things over and over again, and she would never follow the suggestions nor listen to me. When the woman started volunteering information about her childhood traumas, oversharing, Beth felt that a line had been crossed. It wasn't about the trauma per se, but the fact that she would vomit information, lack of boundary recognition, without really listening, haughty behaviour. The next time she called, I told her I only had 15 minutes, and the time after that, I made up an excuse so that we wouldn't speak. Redding says it is especially common for women to work to maintain ties they find unrewarding and even actively unpleasant, often having been conditioned to keep the peace and prioritise other needs above their own. The desire to heal and fix, the conditioning that comes with emotional thinking. Effectively, women are raised to believe that you're either selfish or selfless. She often sees adult women struggling to protect themselves against their overbearing mothers, a particularly painful dynamic, which was probably established in childhood. Or put another way, you have the behavior of an empath that has been conditioned by a narcissist parent. Emotional vampires might also enter into our lives in the form of co-workers or co-parents, Redding says, making it harder to create distance. School friends are another common culprit, as people naturally grow apart over time, but feel reluctant to cut long-standing ties. Just because there's a legacy to this friendship, it doesn't mean that you have a right to choose what shape it takes, says Redding. It's possible to maintain the relationship and still take steps to protect ourselves. She suggests considering how much you can give to this individual and tailoring the interaction to bring out the best in them. Naturally, if you're dealing with a narcissist, this is not sound advice. Now, it's important to point out that not everybody who is being identified as an emotional vampire will be a narcissist. You may have some narcissistic individuals, and as pointed out earlier on, there may be some needy individuals that are behaving in this way as a consequence of the diminution of their emotional empathy caused by an external stressor. But what this article is missing is that many of the behaviours that have just been described by these psychologists and sociologists completely describe the behaviour of a narcissist, and they've missed it. They call this person an emotional vampire, rather than saying what they actually are, which is a narcissist, and allowing a person to understand precisely what that entails. Thus, by not calling it what it is, and labelling it as something else, it becomes misleading and unhelpful. And of course, it is this kind of environment which aids us. The confusion and lack of cohesion in terms of advice, the lack of clarity, makes it all the easier for our kind to move amongst you and do what we do. Oh, they're an emotional vampire. Sounds problematic, but that doesn't tell you this person can't be changed, this person is pursuing the prime aims and is manipulative. It doesn't tell you that all you're going to do is keep on giving and they'll all keep on taking. It doesn't tell you that your own emotional thinking is going to be corrupted by the presence of this individual. No. Instead, they suggest things such as, if you've got someone in your social circle that's really overdramatic, loves chaos and wants to be the centre of attention, maybe don't go out for a coffee with several friends, because it will become that person's show, says Redding. Instead, you could go for a walk together, one-on-one. Nature might help to diffuse that wall of noise, she suggests. Or even better, go and see a film together. Think laterally about how you can enjoy time and space together in a way that feels healthy for you. This advice fails to recognise that you're probably dealing with a narcissist, and the best thing you could do is not go for a walk together, not make it one-on-one, because then the narcissist is going to drink of you all the more, but simply get away from them. Managing our own expectations can also help make those difficult relationships more sustainable, says Manley. Accepting that one particular friend is not inclined to give a listening ear can alleviate your disappointment or anguish when they speak only of themselves. Well, that might be applicable when you're dealing with a non-narcissist, but in all other instances where you're dealing with a narcissist who is most likely to behave that way, that's not going to help you. Cutting old friends loose can backfire, she says. There's something really precious about those relationships. Really? Precious about a relationship that somebody drains you, abuses you, doesn't listen to you, makes you feel depressed. What are you losing? She carries on by stating, there's something really precious about those relationships because they carry the energy of, I knew you when and you knew me when. The minute you part from the relationship, you fracture something in that sense of continuity. But by recognising the value of those shared experiences and memories, the relationship can become a lot easier to maintain, Manley says, despite all the ways in which you might have grown apart. Thus, if you're dealing with a narcissist in that way, not only have you grown apart, but their behaviour is problematic, and yet here you have somebody who's basically telling you, still keep in touch with that person. We don't necessarily need to completely cut off the relationship, she says, which of course is completely contrary to the advice that is appropriate for a narcissist. We simply energetically and emotionally create greater distance. And to tell you the truth, when it comes to the emotional vampire, because they are more egocentric, they may not notice it. Both experts agree that the emotional vampires tend to move on when one energy source cuts off the supply. If this seems callous, consider the cost of maintaining the relationship as it is, says Redding. At the end of the day, it's also okay to protect your peace. It can also pay to be more upfront and give a friend a gentle heads up about how their behaviour is affecting you. No, not when it's a narcissist. It may be an uncomfortable conversation, but it can be productive. Again, not if you're dealing with a narcissist. For Troy, 32, confronting how he and his friend of a decade had drifted apart was helpful in changing their course. They had met at university during a period of change in their lives, but in the subsequent years, Troy's friend had got hung up on a messy breakup. For many years, Troy says, they were stuck in a pattern of him being her shoulder to cry on. Our friendship shifted from a place of feeling mutual to a point where our conversations were always about her and her relationship and how it was affecting her. The gravitational pull was always towards the dark things she was going through. Troy tried to respond with compassion, not only hearing his friend out, but trying different ways to help her move on. I'd always leave our conversations feeling really down, and also that nothing I was doing was helping. There was a period where we even had a moratorium on talking about him because I wasn't interested in having the same conversation we'd been having for the past 5 or 6 years. Eventually, Troy began to withdraw, volunteering less about himself and investing less in the friendship. Matters came to a head when his friend said she felt something had changed between them. They ended up having an argument. It was a very hard conversation and things were said that were not easy for both of us to hear, said Troy. But it also released the tensions that had been building up on both sides. The fight actually acted as a reset button and we sort of made commitments in terms of how we wanted to be better friends to each other, he says. When they met again, a few weeks later, it felt more even. There was a sense that we'd gotten past it. One of Redding's clients recently told an old friend who had complained about feeling lonely how she might be inadvertently pushing people away. The friend took it on, said Redding. So let's not write people off. It's about making that distinction between a nice person who doesn't ruffle feathers and being a kind person who is allowing others to learn and grow. Manley is more circumspect about emotional vampires' ability to change. If they are doing even a modicum of self-work, they may be able to hear you, but in most cases they're not. That's why they have those patterns. It might be that Manley does recognise what they are, but isn't actually saying. For any feedback to be received in good faith, there has to be a desire to change, which, as you all know, there is none with the narcissist. The challenges of vampire friendships may feel particularly heightened and unexpected because the nuclear family has become less dominant as the organising structure of our society. Platonic bonds have been rightly recognised as important and enriching, but the popular description of friends as the family you choose can set up unrealistic expectations and belie the frequent difficulty of navigating them, says Van Hoof. When you look at research, people maintain friendships that they really do not enjoy. The next time you find yourself in a never-ending interview with an emotional vampire, you might look for ways to defang the monster and even to understand them before resorting to banishment. The fact is, what needs to be done is banishment. That in most cases, you're not dealing with an emotional vampire, you're dealing with a narcissist. And the most appropriate thing to do is to ensure that you distance yourself with the principle of GOSO. Once again, an article which fails to recognise what's truly going on here. As I pointed out, there will be individuals that could be described as emotional vampires who are not narcissists, but much of the time that is what they are, and articles such as these give unrealistic expectations about what can be done and doesn't tell people about the clear downsides of continuing to associate with a narcissist. I'm H.G. Tudor. Thank you for listening.